Okay, so my personal testimony and the reason that the church is so important are so completely intertwined that I can't really do one without the other. So I also really hate speaking in front of people, so I just typed everything out so that I can read it. Okay. I have struggled with mental health for most of my life. From elementary school on, I've been in and out of doctors and therapists battling anxiety and depression. There were always times that I felt better and then I'd slide back down again. This roller coaster of highs and lows just felt like something I was bound to be doing my whole life. This roller coaster also had some serious lows ahead that I didn't see coming. After I had our second daughter, I fell into a very severe postpartum depression. This wasn't just the baby blues. This was a dark so encompassing that I could barely breathe. Everything about life with 2 tiny children and a husband with a crazy workload felt overwhelming. And while I was doing my best to try and hide it, to look like a good mother, inside I was drowning. I was so on edge, never happy, resenting my husband, rarely sleeping, and felt completely alone. Each day was its own struggle, another blur to get through, and I was not at all myself. Mark did finally convince me to get some help, but so much damage had already been done. I could no longer think clearly. I was broken, and our marriage was crumbling. We decided that we needed to move closer to Mark's job so that he wasn't spending an additional 2 hours in the car on top of the insane hours he was already putting in. We looked for over a year before we found the house we now call home. And looking back, I can see so clearly how God was already at work in my life. When we moved, I had idealistic hopes of what would now happen, how Mark would now be home for dinner, how we'd have more room in the house for the kids, more space for toys, and all of these things that I thought would help. Circumstances that I thought would fix things, but that's all they were, ideals, dreams, and not at all our reality. I had started back on medication, we moved into a home we hoped to make beautiful, and I was still completely broken. I felt more alone than ever, had no village to speak of with 2 children barely a year apart. Mark and I were so frequently fighting and unhappy that separation and divorce had been mentioned more than once. And in my desperation to feel control over anything, my depression developed a sidekick of its own, an eating disorder. By 2018, I weighed barely 90 pounds. The end of summer 2018 is when we were invited to attend MCBC. I had grown up Lutheran with a slow fade out of church as I got older and had never before heard a message straight from the Bible. I had prayed the prayer at a youth camp, but the more we came here, I realized that they had just been words, that I had never developed a true relationship with Jesus. Not one where I wanted to change my life for him or even let him in enough to change it for me. In September of 2018, I remember sitting in my living room, crying out that I needed the Lord to help pull me out of this miry pit I had been in for so long, and I confirmed my salvation. Not only did this church teach us the Bible, but God put women into my life who saw and recognized my issues and could offer help from experiences of their own. They helped me to see things through the lens of the Bible, the truth. They offered accountability, they had the hard conversations, and they helped me to realize that I had some real problems that I had been making excuses for. Slowly, painfully, I began to see changes in myself, in our family, and in our marriage. We have continued to grow, and by no means have we arrived. We still have struggles to work through and occasional dark days, but I know without a doubt that God brought us to Monmouth because we needed this church, and I needed these women. A lot of these same women have now left the church, which makes the hurt that much more painful. To feel like your original lifeboat was pulled out from under you and now you're clinging to a raft. But God has remained faithful even in the hurt and has fostered new relationships. He's stretched me to be vulnerable and let new people in. He's reminded me that it's okay to reach out when you need help, to ask for counsel, to be vulnerable through the hurt, and let people hold you accountable. That's part of being in this church body, it's part of growth, and it's part of being loved by all of you. This mindset, this family, a relationship with Jesus that I didn't know was possible, have all helped to turn my life around and completely alter the path that our family was headed down. This church gave me all of that. This church taught me the truth of God's word, that he can and will turn things around if you let him. If you build a relationship with him, but also his body of people. If you surrender to him, to the authority he has put in place for you, and you trust in that. So yes, there's been a lot of hurt recently, a lot of questions, even some anger. But I have continued on knowing that God brought us here to this town, to this church, to save us. And if someday another problem or hurt leads to my feelings or my thoughts telling me that I should go, then I know from past experiences that the opposite is true. My own thoughts and feelings can't be trusted, but instead, I know in times of uncertainty, doubt, or darkness that in this building, with this group of people that have become our family, is exactly where I need to be.
You know, even though I'm on the radio, it's a lot easier to talk on the radio to thousands of people than it is a small group. But so I wrote my stuff down too. You know, a lot of you may know my testimony. I grew up in church. In fact, I grew up at Emmanuel Baptist, and I was on fire for the Lord when I was a kid. You know, I learned my Bible verses, loved Sunday school, loved junior church. And one day on the way home, Dad's like, you know, it's more than just going to church. You got to accept Jesus as your personal Savior, you know. And I was like, well, I want that. So, you know, I accepted Jesus, was baptized, was going to church. But then something happened. I graduated, moved out on my own. And, you know, life, working a lot on the weekends. I was doing radio. And when you're first in radio, you're always working on the weekends, you know, working the shifts nobody wants. And so I stopped going to church. But the real reason I stopped going to church really wasn't the workload, to be honest with you. And it went that way for a long time. I kind of become a C&E person, you know, the Christmas and Easter person. And that went on for a long time. Then about 20 years or so ago, my dad had a heart attack. And it was basically what you call a widowmaker. He shouldn't have survived that heart attack. But thanks the Lord, he was already in the emergency room because he had had some pains in his neck. And Mom was like, well, we better go to the emergency room and get checked out. So while he was in the emergency room, he went into cardiac arrest. And they had to fly him to Peoria. And it was the timing, too. I mean, God's timing is amazing because the very next day, he was supposed to go on a cruise. So if he would have been on that cruise, he would have been gone. And I was going to watch my brother's kids, and I remember I'm sitting in my apartment, and I was getting ready to go over to because he was going on the trip too, and I heard life flight flow overhead. And, you know, I didn't think nothing of it. I lived close to the hospital, but, you know, didn't think nothing of it. So I go over to my brother's house because I was going to meet with them, talk about, you know, what to do, watching his two boys. And his father-in-law, mother-in-law were there, and they said, haven't you heard? Your dad's was flown to Peoria. Very little did I know that life flight helicopter I heard over my house was taking my dad to Peoria. Thankfully, he survived, and he's still doing well there. But I truly believe that heart attack was God saying, hey, you know, it's time to wake up. You know, you've been falling away from me for so long. And it was my cue that I needed to rebuild my relationship with Jesus. Started going to Bethel Baptist Church. Shortly after that, I met my wife, and we just kind of felt like a number there. And I remember my brother, him and his family were coming here, and I thought, well, I'll give Maple City Baptist a try. And I was talking to a guy that went to Bethel, and he's like, oh, you don't want to go there. That church, that's a cult. And I'm like, okay. So I come to Maple City Baptist Church. And now I grew up in a church where pastors wore suits and ties. I get there and I sit down. Here's Mike in jeans and a shirt and a camo shirt and a mohawk. And I'm thinking, I better really pay attention here. But, you know, it's like I'm sitting there, I'm listening, and it's like, this dude's preaching the Bible. I go, if we're a cult, we're a Jesus cult. You know, Jesus is our leader. And we've been here ever since. You know, we began to grow here. We went to, you know, shortly after we started coming here, Sherry and I got married. Started going through discipleship. Started teaching Sunday school. Went through Bible Institute. And started preaching. You know, I was preaching at the Rescue Mission once a month and even preached here a couple times. And you know, it was great. You know, I never thought I'd be preaching. But, and then COVID hit. And then, you know, we all had to stay in our homes, which was bogus. But, you know, and we're doing church by video. And it was, you know, okay, but it just wasn't the same. And shortly, you know, after being away so long, I didn't realize my fire was kind of going out again. You see, it's like a pile of coals. As long as that pile of coals is together, it stays hot. But once you start separating those piles of coals, it starts to cool off again. And no, you don't need church to get to heaven or, to be saved, but you need you need church to stay hot, so you can stay hot. It's kind of like the REO Speedwagon song, keep that fire burning, right? And I love this church. I mean, we're family. Mike and Bo and their families invested so much in our family and in other people's families. And I love how this church invests in itself. I mean, just take an example, with discipleship. We're not just about getting people saved. Sure, we want to get people saved, but we want to get people growing in the relationship with Jesus. And that's what's important. From VBS, look what we do with VBS every year. I mean, that's amazing. I mean, how many churches can say they get the majority of their members together and come every night for VBS to help out? It's because we love God and we love kids and we love to get people to find Jesus. You don't get many churches to do that, but we have the same purpose, to reach people for Jesus. And I believe we truly care about each other. And that's why it hurts so much when people leave, especially when they don't even give a reason. If you're moving, okay, there's a good reason. God takes you to minister somewhere else. That's a good reason. Or if the church isn't preaching the Bible, that's a good reason. But we don't have that reason here. We preach Jesus, And I'm sure other churches out there are good, but, I can't imagine going anywhere else. I mean, this church means so much to me. I mean, it's family, and I love everybody here. But this place is home. So.